Part 1. The Island That Waited. In the summer of 1943, more than 34,000 soldiers prepared to storm a fortress. American and Canadian troops, sailors aboard hundreds of ships, pilots ready to provide air support. It would be one of the largest amphibious operations in the Pacific Theater to that point. Months of planning, weeks of preparation, all focused on a single target, an island called Kiska. What happened next was something no military planner had anticipated. Something that would become both embarrassing and darkly comic in hindsight, but which in the moment was deadly serious and genuinely frightening. This is the story of the ghost battle of Kiska, the invasion where the enemy wasn't there, where soldiers fought shadows and weather and their own nerves, where men died without ever seeing the opponent they had come to fight. It's a strange story, a story about fog and fear and the peculiar nature of warfare when nothing goes as expected. But like the story of Attu, which we've told before, it's a story worth remembering, because it tells us something true about war, about human nature, and about the unexpected ways history unfolds. Let's begin. Kiska is part of the Aleutian Islands, that chain of volcanic peaks stretching from Alaska toward Asia. It lies about 200 miles east of Attu, which makes it slightly less remote but no less harsh. The island is roughly 17 miles long and varies in width from 2 to 6 miles. Like Attu, Kiska is mountainous and treeless. The highest peak rises about 4,000 feet above the cold waters of the North Pacific. Valleys run between the mountains, and on the northern side of the island is a harbour, one of the few protected anchorages in the entire Aleutian chain. That harbour is why Kiska mattered strategically. A fleet could anchor there, protected from the Pacific storms. Seaplanes could operate from the harbour. Submarines could use it as a base. In the vast, empty spaces of the North Pacific, a good harbour was valuable. Before the war, Kiska was home to a small weather station and not much else. The Aleutians had never permanently settled there, though they visited seasonally. It was too exposed, too harsh even by Aleutian standards. But in June 1942, when Japanese forces occupied both Attu and Kiska as part of their Aleutian campaign, Kiska became a military base. The Japanese garrison was larger than the one on Attu, eventually numbering over 5,400 men. They built installations, fortified positions, established a submarine base, and created what they hoped would be a thorn in the side of American operations in the North Pacific. For more than a year, Kiska remained in Japanese hands. American forces bombed it regularly, ships shelled it, submarines patrolled the waters around it. But the island remained occupied, a piece of American territory under enemy control. After the bloody battle for Attu in May 1943, American military planners turned their attention to Kiska. It was the last occupied piece of American soil, and it had to be retaken. The operation to invade Kiska would be called Operation Cottage, and it would become one of the strangest episodes of World War II. Part 2. Planning the invasion. The military planners approaching the problem of Kiska in the summer of 1943 had learned lessons from Attu. Hard lessons, paid for in blood and suffering. They knew the Aleutian weather would be terrible. They knew the terrain would be difficult. They knew Japanese defenders would fight to the death rather than surrender. And they knew that intelligence about enemy positions and strength was often incomplete or wrong. With all this in mind, they planned an overwhelming assault. If the Japanese on Attu, numbering perhaps 2,500, had cost the Americans so dearly, then the Japanese on Kiska, numbering more than 5,000 according to intelligence estimates, would require an even larger force. The assault force was set at 34,000 troops. American units from the 7th Infantry Division, veterans of Attu, would participate. So would units that had been training specifically for Arctic warfare. And for the first time in the Pacific War, Canadian forces would join an American operation in significant numbers. The 13th Canadian Infantry Brigade would fight alongside their American allies. The naval support would be massive. Nearly 100 ships, including battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and transports. The Bombardment Group alone had enough firepower to level everything on the island. Air support would come from bases throughout the Aleutians. Bombers had been hitting Kiska for months, softening up the defenses. Once the invasion began, the plan called for continuous airstrikes on Japanese positions. It was, by any measure, a formidable force. More than enough, everyone believed, to overcome the Japanese garrison despite the lessons of Attu. The ratio of attackers to defenders would be more than 6-1. The firepower advantage was even more lopsided. The intelligence picture on Kiska was both extensive and, as it would turn out, critically flawed. American reconnaissance flights had photographed the island repeatedly. They had identified fortifications, gun positions, troop concentrations, and supply dumps. They had counted buildings and estimated garrison strength based on what they could observe. Submarines had surveyed the coastline, identifying potential landing beaches and approaches. They had photographed shore defenses and recorded the positions of artillery. Raids by small units had gone ashore at night, gathering soil samples to determine if beaches would support tanks and vehicles. Some of these raids had encountered Japanese patrols, leading to brief firefights before the raiders withdrew. All of this intelligence pointed to a well-defended island with a substantial garrison. The Japanese were clearly still there in force. Smoke from fires was visible. Radio traffic was detected. When planes flew over, anti-aircraft fire rose to meet them. What the intelligence failed to detect was that everything had changed. The signs of occupation that observers saw were either remnants from an earlier time or carefully maintained deceptions. The truth was something no one suspected. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's stay with the invasion force as it prepared for what everyone believed would be a major battle. Part 3. The soldiers. The men who would storm Kiska came from diverse backgrounds, but they shared certain characteristics. They were young, mostly in their late teens and early 20s. They had trained hard, and they were nervous. The veterans of Attu knew what they were facing. They had been through it once already, had survived the cold and the fog and the killing. Now they were being asked to do it again. Some felt a grim determination. They knew what needed to be done, and they would do it. Others felt a quiet dread. How many times could you survive this kind of fight? The soldiers who hadn't fought on Attu were nervous for different reasons. They had heard the stories. They knew the casualty figures. They had been told this might be even worse than Attu, because the Japanese garrison on Kiska was larger and had been there longer, with more time to fortify. The Canadian troops had their own concerns. This would be their first major combat operation in the Pacific Theatre. They wanted to prove themselves, to show they could fight alongside the Americans as equals. But they also knew they were heading into conditions unlike anything they had trained for. Everyone had been issued the best cold weather gear available, improvements based on the Attu experience. Better boots, warmer clothing, waterproof outer layers. But the veterans of Attu knew that no amount of gear could fully protect you from the Aleutian environment. The training in the weeks before the invasion had been intense. Amphibious landing practice, live fire exercises, conditioning marches with full packs. The commanders wanted their men as ready as possible. But there's no training that can fully prepare you for combat. Everyone knew that. The reality would be different from the practice, and some of them wouldn't come home. On the transport ships, as the convoy steamed toward Kiska in mid-August, soldiers tried to keep their minds occupied. Some played cards. Some wrote letters home, carefully worded because of censorship, saying they were fine and would write again when they could. Some cleaned their weapons repeatedly, a ritual that provided comfort and a sense of control. Others tried to sleep, knowing they should rest while they could, but finding that sleep wouldn't come. The ships themselves were crowded and uncomfortable. Thousands of men packed into spaces designed for far fewer. The air below decks was stale. Seasickness affected many, especially when the convoy hit rough weather in the North Pacific. Officers gave briefings, going over the plan again and again. Each unit had specific objectives. The landing beaches were designated. The order of battle was established. Everything was as organized as military planning could make it. But everyone who had ever been in combat knew that plans rarely survived contact with the enemy. Once the shooting started, chaos would take over. Units would get separated. Communication would break down. Men would have to make decisions based on incomplete information and the immediate circumstances they faced. That's what they expected. That's what they prepared for. A hard fight against a determined enemy in terrible conditions. Another battle like Attu, perhaps worse. None of them imagined what actually awaited them on Kiska. Part 4. The Bombardment. Before any troops would land on Kiska, the island would be subjected to a massive bombardment. This was standard practice for amphibious assaults, and the lessons of Attu had reinforced its importance. The more damage you could do to enemy positions before your soldiers went ashore, the fewer casualties you would take. The naval bombardment began on August 13, 1943. Battleships and cruisers took positions offshore and began firing their heavy guns at identified targets on the island. The thunder of the big naval rifles was immense. Shells weighing hundreds of pounds arced through the air and slammed into Kiska. The plan was to destroy fortifications, gun emplacements, and troop concentrations. To make the island as soft a target as possible before the infantry went in. The bombardment continued for days. Thousands of shells were fired. From the ships, observers watched through binoculars as explosions erupted across the island. Fires started. Smoke rose into the already grey sky. But there was something odd about the bombardment, something that some observers noted but most dismissed. There was no return fire. The Japanese guns that intelligence had identified stayed silent. No shots came back at the bombarding ships. This wasn't entirely surprising. The Japanese might be conserving ammunition, waiting for the invasion itself before revealing their positions. Or perhaps the bombardment had already destroyed their coastal guns. Either way, the ships kept firing. Aircraft joined the bombardment. Bombers flew mission after mission, dropping tons of explosives on the island. They hit the harbour installations, the suspected troop barracks, the supply dumps. Pilots reported good hits, buildings destroyed, fires burning. Still, no anti-aircraft fire came up to meet them. The skies over Kiska were eerily quiet except for the sound of American engines and falling bombs. Some intelligence officers found this troubling. They began to wonder if something was different about Kiska, if perhaps their estimates of enemy strength were wrong. But the prevailing view was that the Japanese were simply being cautious, staying under cover, waiting for the right moment to fight. The aerial reconnaissance continued even as the bombardment proceeded. Photographers flew over the island, taking pictures to assess damage and update intelligence. The photographs showed destroyed buildings and cratered ground. But they also showed something puzzling. The number of visible installations seemed to be decreasing, but there was no corresponding increase in observed Japanese activity. No signs of troops being moved around, no new defensive positions being dug, no apparent response to the devastation being rained down on them. One reconnaissance pilot, in a report that was filed but not given much weight at the time, noted that Kiska looked abandoned. The settlement near the harbour showed no signs of life. No smoke from cooking fires, no movement of personnel, nothing. But this report competed with other observations. Some pilots reported seeing anti-aircraft positions that looked ready for use. Others noted that certain buildings appeared intact and possibly occupied. The intelligence picture remained confused. The commanders planning the invasion had to make decisions based on incomplete information, as commanders always do. The weight of evidence, they believed, suggested that Kiska was still defended. The Japanese were known to be skilled at camouflage and deception. The lack of visible activity might just mean they were hiding well. And so the plan continued. The bombardment would cease shortly before the landing. Then 34,000 troops would go ashore and fight what everyone expected would be a brutal battle for the island. The date was set, August 15, 1943, D-Day for Operation Cottage. Part 5. The Landing. In the early morning hours of August 15th, the ships carrying the invasion force took their positions off Kiska. The bombardment had ceased. Now came the most dangerous part of any amphibious operation, the moment when soldiers had to leave the relative safety of the ships and cross open water to reach the beach. The weather was, predictably, terrible. Fog shrouded the island. Visibility was poor. The sea was rough, not dangerously so, but enough to make the landing craft pitch and roll as they were loaded. Soldiers climbed down cargo nets into the landing craft, a tricky business with full packs and weapons. Some men slipped. Most made it safely. The craft filled with troops, 30 or 40 men packed into each one, and then pulled away from the transports, forming up for the run to the beach. The first wave headed toward shore. Officers checked their watches, trying to keep to the timetable. The men in the landing craft were mostly silent, each alone with his thoughts, despite being pressed shoulder to shoulder with his comrades. This was it. The moment they had trained for, worried about, tried not to think about too much. In a few minutes, they would hit the beach. The ramps would drop. They would run forward into whatever waited for them. The landing craft approached the shore. The helmsman tried to judge the right moment to run up onto the beach. Behind them, more waves of landing craft were already on their way. The invasion was in motion. The ramps dropped. Soldiers poured out, weapons ready, expecting fire at any moment. They splashed through shallow water and onto the rocky beach. They spread out, moving forward, looking for cover, waiting for the shooting to start. Nothing happened. No machine gun fire swept the beach. No mortars fell among them. The silence was broken only by the sounds of the surf, the engines of the landing craft, and the shouted orders of sergeants and officers. The first wave moved inland. Behind them, more boats were landing. More men poured onto the beach, thousands of them now, spreading out across the island. Still no resistance, no enemy fire at all. It was eerie. Soldiers moved forward cautiously, expecting ambush at every turn. They checked buildings and found them empty. They approached fortifications and found them abandoned. Bunkers that had been identified in reconnaissance photos were there, but no one manned them. Some soldiers began to think the unthinkable. Maybe the Japanese weren't here. Maybe they had withdrawn. But that seemed impossible. An entire garrison doesn't just disappear. And intelligence had been so certain. There had to be Japanese soldiers here somewhere, probably dug in deep, waiting to spring a trap. The advance continued, careful and slow. Officers tried to maintain unit cohesion, tried to follow the plan even though the plan had assumed resistance that wasn't materializing. Radio operators called back to the command ships, reporting the strange situation. No contact with the enemy, no resistance encountered. On the command ships, senior officers tried to make sense of the reports. This had to be a Japanese tactical decision, they reasoned. The defenders were letting the Americans land, drawing them inland, where they could be more easily trapped and destroyed. It was the only explanation that made sense. Orders went out to advance cautiously, to be ready for the attack that must surely be coming. Artillery units landed and set up, ready to provide support. Tanks rolled off landing craft and began moving inland, their crews tense, expecting to meet Japanese anti-tank guns at any moment. By afternoon, thousands of American and Canadian soldiers were spread across Kiska. They had penetrated deep into the island, had taken positions that should have been fiercely defended, and they still hadn't found any Japanese. The fog remained thick. Visibility was often less than 50 yards. In those conditions, nerves were stretched tight. Every sound might be the enemy. Every shadow might be a soldier. And then the shooting started. Part 6. Fighting Ghosts. The first shots fired on Kiska came not from Japanese positions, but from American and Canadian troops shooting at what they thought were the enemy. In the fog and confusion, with nerves wound tight and everyone expecting attack at any moment, soldiers began to mistake their own comrades for the Japanese. A shape in the fog, a sound of movement. A nervous soldier squeezed his trigger, and suddenly everyone nearby was firing. These incidents, which would later be called friendly fire, happened repeatedly throughout the first day and into the night. American units fired on Canadian units. Canadian units fired on American units. Units fired on other units from their own force who they hadn't realized were nearby. The results were tragic. Men were killed and wounded by bullets fired by their own side. The exact numbers would never be fully established because in the confusion, casualties from different incidents got mixed together. But by the time the truth about Kiska became clear, dozens of soldiers had been killed or wounded in these friendly fire incidents. The fog made everything worse. In conditions where you couldn't see more than a few dozen yards, it was nearly impossible to identify targets with certainty. A helmet glimpsed through the mist. Was it American or Japanese? A soldier heard a voice speaking in a language he didn't understand. Was it Japanese, or was it one of the Canadian units where French was spoken? Split-second decisions made in fear and confusion led to terrible mistakes. A patrol encountered another patrol in the fog. Someone fired. Everyone fired. When the smoke cleared, Americans had killed Americans, or Canadians had killed Canadians, or Americans and Canadians had killed each other. The nighttime was worse. In the darkness and fog combined, visibility dropped to almost nothing. Units dug in, establishing defensive perimeters, certain that a Japanese attack would come under cover of darkness. Sentries stared into the black fog, their ears straining for any sound. Every natural noise became potentially threatening. Wind in the grass, a rock dislodged and rolling down a hill, an animal moving in the darkness. All of these things could make a nervous sentry think the enemy was approaching. And when a sentry thought he heard the enemy, he might fire. That first shot would trigger others. Soon, entire units would be firing into the darkness at targets they couldn't see, couldn't identify, perhaps didn't even exist. Flares were fired, attempting to illuminate the ground in front of defensive positions. But the fog was so thick that flares often just created a diffuse glow that illuminated nothing and ruined night vision. Soldiers fired at shadows, at shapes that might have been men, or might have been rocks or bushes. In the morning, patrols would go out to check the ground where they had been firing. Sometimes they found nothing. Sometimes they found the bodies of their own men who had been in positions no one had known about, or who had been trying to move during the night and had been mistaken for the enemy. The psychological toll was immense. To kill and be killed by your own side, in confusion and fog, while the actual enemy was nowhere to be found, this was a special kind of horror. It wasn't the glorious combat soldiers had been trained for. It was chaos and tragedy, born of fear and poor visibility. Part 7. The truth emerges. As more time passed and more of Kiska was explored, the truth became increasingly apparent. The Japanese were gone. The entire garrison had been evacuated. Soldiers found evidence of recent occupation. Meals left half-eaten, still relatively fresh. Equipment abandoned. Personal items left behind. It became clear that the Japanese had been on Kiska until quite recently, but they weren't here now. Intelligence officers tried to piece together what had happened. They examined Japanese documents left behind. They studied the abandoned installations. And gradually, the story emerged. In late July 1943, the Japanese High Command had made a decision. Kiska was no longer strategically valuable enough to justify keeping a garrison there. The island was under constant bombardment. Supply ships couldn't reach it safely. The garrison was isolated and served no useful purpose. A plan was developed to evacuate the entire force. It would be risky. American naval forces patrolled the waters around Kiska constantly. American aircraft flew reconnaissance missions daily. But if it could be done under the right conditions, the entire garrison might be saved. The Japanese chose their moment carefully. On July 29, 1943, a thick fog bank rolled in over Kiska. It was the kind of fog that made visibility almost zero, the kind that grounded aircraft and made naval operations difficult. Under cover of that fog, a Japanese naval force approached Kiska. cruisers and destroyers moving cautiously through waters they knew were dangerous. They entered Kiska harbour, embarked the entire garrison of over 5,000 men, and slipped away before the fog lifted. It was a brilliantly executed operation. The Americans, despite all their surveillance and patrols, never detected it. The ships came and went like ghosts, carrying away the defenders under the noses of the forces preparing to invade. For more than 2 weeks after the evacuation, American intelligence continued to believe Kiska was occupied. The Japanese had left behind booby traps and time-delayed explosives to maintain the illusion. Some of these created fires and explosions that looked like the results of bombing or the activities of an active garrison. Radio transmissions were broadcast from other locations to make it seem like Kiska was still in communication with Japanese commanders. The deception was maintained just long enough. By the time the Americans landed on August 15th, the Japanese had been gone for more than 2 weeks. The invasion force of 34,000 men had come to fight 5,000 defenders who weren't there. When this truth became clear, reactions were mixed. Some soldiers felt relief. They had survived what they expected would be a bloody battle. Others felt foolish, having worked themselves up for combat that never came. Many felt angry at the intelligence failure that had led to the entire operation. The senior commanders were embarrassed. How had such a large-scale evacuation been missed? How had they committed such massive resources to an invasion of an unoccupied island? The questions would echo through military channels for years, but the immediate problem was practical. There were over 30,000 soldiers on Kiska. Some of them had been killed or wounded by friendly fire. All of them needed to be withdrawn. The island needed to be secured and eventually either garrisoned or abandoned. The operation that had been planned as a combat mission was now a logistical exercise in withdrawal. Part 8. Casualties without combat. The final casualty figures from the Kiska operation were sobering. Though no enemy forces were encountered, the operation was far from bloodless. At least 24 soldiers were killed. Most died from friendly fire incidents, shot by their own comrades in the fog and confusion. Some died from booby traps left behind by the Japanese. A few died from accidents, the inevitable result of moving thousands of men and heavy equipment in difficult terrain and poor weather. Nearly 50 more were wounded. Again, most of these wounds came from friendly fire. Some soldiers were injured in accidents, falls on steep terrain, vehicles overturning, equipment malfunctions. And then there were the casualties that didn't show up in official reports but were real nonetheless. Soldiers who would carry psychological scars from having shot at their own comrades, from the terror of fighting an enemy that wasn't there, from the confusion and chaos of those days on Kiska. One incident highlighted the tragedy particularly sharply. A Canadian unit encountered an American unit in thick fog. Neither realized who the other was. A firefight erupted. When it was over, several men on both sides were dead or wounded. They had killed each other while the enemy they had come to fight was hundreds of miles away. These casualties were harder to explain than combat losses would have been. In combat, soldiers die, and that's understood as part of war. But to die from confusion, from fog, from mistakes made by your own side, that seemed meaningless in a way that combat death somehow wasn't. The officers who had to write letters home to families faced a particularly difficult task. How do you tell a mother that her son was killed not by the enemy, but by another American soldier who mistook him for Japanese in the fog? How do you frame that loss as meaningful or honorable? Some letters were carefully worded to suggest combat had occurred. They spoke of the soldier's bravery, his service to his country, his sacrifice in a necessary operation. They didn't explicitly lie, but they didn't tell the full truth either. Other letters were more honest and perhaps more difficult for families to receive. Your son was killed by friendly fire. He died in an accident of war. He was a casualty of confusion and circumstance. Either way, the grief was real. Whether a soldier dies from enemy fire or friendly fire, from combat or accident, his family's loss is the same. The men who died on Kiska died in service to their country, even if the manner of their death was different from what anyone expected. The wounded faced their own challenges. Some had physical injuries that would heal, though they might carry scars. Others had psychological wounds that would prove more lasting. The memory of shooting at shadows, of perhaps having killed one of your own comrades, these were burdens that some would carry for the rest of their lives. And all of this happened without ever seeing the enemy. The men on Kiska had prepared for one kind of battle and experienced something completely different. In some ways, that made it harder to process. There was no clear narrative of combat, no straightforward story to tell about what happened. Part 9. The Investigation. In the aftermath of the Kiska operation, the military began a thorough investigation. Multiple questions needed answers. How had the Japanese evacuation been missed? Why had intelligence been so wrong? What could be learned to prevent similar failures in the future? The investigation revealed a series of intelligence failures and unfortunate coincidences that together had created the perfect conditions for the mistake. First, the Japanese evacuation had been conducted with exceptional skill and under perfect weather conditions. The fog that covered their withdrawal was thicker than usual, grounding American aircraft that might have spotted the evacuation fleet. Second, American submarines patrolling the area had been positioned based on expected Japanese supply routes. The evacuation fleet had taken a different route, one that avoided the American submarines by luck or by excellent intelligence on the Japanese part. Third, the Japanese deception measures had been effective. The booby traps that created explosions, the radio traffic that suggested continued occupation, the careful maintenance of certain facilities to make them appear active from aerial reconnaissance, all of this had worked as intended. Fourth, American intelligence had suffered from a kind of confirmation bias. They expected Kiska to be occupied, so they interpreted the evidence in ways that confirmed that expectation. Ambiguous signs were read as proof of occupation rather than as potential indicators of evacuation. Finally, there had been time pressure. After the costly battle for Attu, commanders wanted to clear the Aleutians as quickly as possible. This pressure may have led to less thorough analysis of intelligence before committing to the invasion. The investigation's findings led to changes in how intelligence was gathered and analysed. More emphasis was placed on questioning assumptions. More resources were devoted to surveillance before major operations. The lessons were painful, but they were learned. But the investigation couldn't change what had happened. Kiska remained an embarrassing episode, something that reflected poorly on American military intelligence and planning. It was the kind of mistake that, in a different context, might have been catastrophic. If the Japanese had been more strategically positioned, if they had been able to respond to the invasion of an unoccupied island by striking elsewhere, the consequences could have been severe. As it happened, the main consequence was the casualties from friendly fire and the blow to military prestige. In the larger context of World War II, Kiska was a footnote, an oddity, a strange episode that didn't affect the overall course of the war. But for the families of those who died there, it was everything. Their sons and brothers and husbands had been killed in one of the strangest military operations of the war. And for the soldiers who survived it, Kiska remained a confusing memory, a battle that wasn't a battle, a victory that didn't feel like victory. Part 10. The Japanese Success. While the American military was dealing with the embarrassment of invading an empty island, the Japanese military was celebrating one of their most successful operations of the entire Aleutian campaign. The evacuation of Kiska had been a complete success from the Japanese perspective. Over 5,000 soldiers who had been written off as lost, who had been stranded on a remote island under constant bombardment, had been brought home safely. The operation had required careful planning and precise execution. The naval force had to travel through waters patrolled by American submarines and within range of American aircraft. They had to time their arrival to coincide with weather conditions that would provide cover. They had to embark over 5,000 men and all the equipment and supplies they could save, then escape without being detected. That they accomplished all of this spoke to the skill of Japanese naval operations in the North Pacific. They knew these waters well, They had operated in the Aleutians for over a year and had learned to use the weather and geography to their advantage. For the soldiers evacuated from Kiska, the escape was a deliverance. They had expected to die on that island, either in battle when the Americans finally invaded or slowly from starvation and cold if supply ships couldn't reach them. Instead, they were sailing toward safety, toward Japan, toward home. The contrast with Attu was stark. On Attu, the entire garrison had fought to the death or taken their own lives. On Kiska, the entire garrison was saved. From a military perspective, saving over 5,000 trained soldiers was far preferable to losing them in a hopeless defensive battle. The Japanese military made some propaganda use of the Kiska evacuation. It was portrayed as an example of clever tactics and superior skill, of outwitting the larger American forces. The fact that the Americans had then invaded an empty island was presented as proof of American incompetence. But the truth was more complex than propaganda allowed. The evacuation of Kiska was a success, but it was also an acknowledgement that the Aleutian campaign had failed. The Japanese had hoped to use the Aleutians as a base for operations against Alaska and to threaten American supply lines to the Soviet Union. None of that had materialized. Instead, they had occupied two remote islands at significant cost, had been driven from one of them in a bloody battle, and had been forced to abandon the other. The net result was a year of effort for no strategic gain. The soldiers evacuated from Kiska would be needed elsewhere. The war in the Pacific was turning against Japan. Island after island was falling to American advances. Every trained soldier, every ship, every aircraft would be desperately needed in the battles to come. In that context, saving the Kiska garrison was indeed a success. But it was a small success in a war that was going badly. A clever evacuation couldn't change the larger strategic picture. Still, for the men who had been on Kiska, who had endured months of isolation and bombardment, who had been certain they would die on that cold island, the evacuation was a miracle. They had been given a second chance at life. Many of them would fight again, on other islands, in other battles. But they had survived Kiska, and that was something. Part 11. The Soldiers Remember. For the American and Canadian soldiers who participated in the Kiska operation, the memories were complicated and often difficult to discuss. There was the relief of not having to fight, of landing on an island where no one shot at them, where they didn't have to watch friends die or face death themselves in the way they had expected. That relief was real and significant. But there was also frustration and a strange kind of anticlimax. They had prepared for battle, had worked themselves up to face combat, had accepted that they might die. And then nothing happened. It was like being psychologically ready to jump off a cliff and finding out at the last moment that the cliff wasn't there. Some soldiers felt foolish. They had been scared of an enemy who wasn't present. They had fired weapons at shadows and fog. In the worst cases, they had killed or been killed by friendly fire while the actual enemy was long gone. Veterans of Kiska often found it hard to talk about their experience. If you told people you had fought in the Pacific, they wanted to hear about combat, about battles with the Japanese. How do you explain that you invaded an island where the enemy had already left? That the biggest danger you faced was being shot by your own side? It became easier, often, to simply not mention Kiska, to let people assume you had fought in more conventional battles, to keep the strange truth of your war experience to yourself. The veterans who had fought on both Attu and Kiska had a particularly complex perspective. They had experienced the worst kind of combat on Attu, brutal and costly fighting in terrible conditions. Then they had experienced the strange anticlimax of Kiska, preparation for combat that never came, but was tragic nonetheless. Some of these veterans found a kind of dark humor in the contrast. They had survived Attu, where thousands of Japanese fought to the death. Then they had invaded Kiska, where the Japanese had left without a fight. The randomness of it, The way that fate could be so different on two similar islands separated by just 200 miles, it seemed to highlight the arbitrary nature of war. Others found no humor in it at all. They had lost friends on Attu to Japanese bullets. Then they had lost friends on Kiska to American bullets. The distinction didn't make the loss any easier to bear. Dead was dead, whether killed by the enemy or by your own side. As the years passed and World War II moved further into history, Kiska became even more obscure than it had been. Attu, while not widely remembered, at least had the characteristics of a traditional battle. It could be told as a story of combat and valor and sacrifice. Kiska didn't fit any narrative template. It was a battle that wasn't a battle, a victory that involved invading an empty island. Casualties without combat. It was too strange, too embarrassing, too hard to explain, easier to let it be forgotten. But the men who were there never forgot. They carried Kiska with them, along with whatever other war experiences they had. It remained a part of their story, even if it was a part they rarely told. Part 12. Lessons and Aftermath. Despite the embarrassment of invading an unoccupied island, the military did extract some valuable lessons from the Kiska operation. The most obvious lesson was about intelligence. The operation had proceeded based on intelligence that turned out to be wrong. This highlighted the need for better surveillance, for more careful analysis of evidence, for questioning assumptions before committing massive resources to an operation. In the months and years that followed, intelligence gathering in the Pacific improved. More emphasis was placed on different types of reconnaissance. Submarine patrols were coordinated more effectively. Photo analysts were trained to look for signs of evacuation as well as signs of occupation. The friendly fire casualties on Kiska also led to important tactical changes. The incidents in the fog demonstrated the deadly consequences of poor visibility combined with trigger-happy soldiers expecting enemy contact. New procedures were developed for unit identification in low visibility conditions. Better communication equipment was issued. Passwords and recognition signals were standardized. Training emphasized fire discipline, the importance of positive target identification before shooting. These changes wouldn't eliminate friendly fire incidents. Nothing could do that entirely, but they would reduce their frequency. The Kiska operation also demonstrated the importance of realistic planning. The assumption that the Japanese would fight to the last man, while true on Attu, had not been universal. The enemy was capable of tactical retreats, of choosing when and where to fight. American planners needed to account for this flexibility in future operations. On a broader level, Kiska showed that in war, the unexpected often happens. That all your preparation might be for the wrong battle. That the enemy gets a vote in how events unfold. These are lessons every military professional knows intellectually, but Kiska drove them home in a particularly vivid way. After the invasion, Kiska was garrisoned by American forces, though with a much smaller presence than had been planned for operations against Japanese defenders. The island became another link in the chain of bases and weather stations throughout the Aleutians. But Kiska never became strategically important. The war had moved on. The island-hopping campaigns were occurring thousands of miles to the south and west. The Aleutian campaign, which had never been central to either side's strategy, faded into insignificance. The bases on Kiska were maintained through the end of the war, then gradually reduced. By the 1950s, the military presence on the island had been withdrawn. Like Attu, Kiska reverted to its natural state, empty and windswept, of interest mainly to researchers and the occasional adventurer. The cost of the Aleutian campaign, including both Attu and Kiska, was significant. Thousands of casualties, friendly fire deaths included, massive expenditure of resources and effort. Ships lost to weather and enemy action. Aircraft crashed in the fog and storms. And what had been gained? The Japanese had been driven from American territory, which was psychologically important, but strategically minor. The bases established in the Aleutians provided some capability for operations against Japan's northern territories, but these operations never materialized on a significant scale. In the calculus of war, the Aleutian campaign was a sideshow. It diverted resources from both sides that might have been used elsewhere. But sideshows have their own importance, and for the men who fought there, the Aleutians were the centre of their war. Part 13. The Fog of War. The phrase fog of war is often used to describe the uncertainty and confusion of combat. It refers to the difficulty of knowing what's really happening in battle, of having accurate information, of making good decisions with incomplete knowledge. Kiska is a perfect example of the fog of war, but with a literal fog added to the metaphorical one. The actual fog that covered the island made visibility impossible. But the metaphorical fog, the uncertainty about enemy intentions and locations, was equally thick. American commanders thought they knew the situation on Kiska. Intelligence told them the island was occupied. Reconnaissance seemed to confirm it. All the evidence pointed to a defended island that would have to be taken by force. But the evidence was wrong, or misinterpreted, or outdated. The Japanese had made their move under cover of literal fog, but they had also benefited from the metaphorical fog of war. The Americans couldn't see what was happening. They couldn't know that the evacuation had occurred. They operated based on assumptions that had been valid but were no longer true. When American and Canadian soldiers landed on Kiska and found no enemy, they were still operating in the fog of war. They didn't know the island was empty. Every shadow could hide a Japanese soldier. Every bunker might contain defenders. The uncertainty was as dangerous as actual combat would have been, because it led to the friendly fire incidents that claimed lives. Kiska teaches us something important about warfare and human nature. We operate based on the information we have, but that information is always incomplete. We make plans, but those plans are based on assumptions about what the enemy will do. When the enemy does something unexpected, our plans become obsolete. The generals planning the invasion of Kiska assumed the Japanese would defend the island. That assumption seemed reasonable based on Japanese behavior elsewhere, based on intelligence reports, based on what logic suggested. But the Japanese High Command had made a different calculation. They chose evacuation over defense, survival over sacrifice. Neither choice was wrong from a military standpoint. On Attu, the Japanese defenders chose to fight to the death and inflicted significant casualties on the attackers. On Kiska, they chose to evacuate and saved over 5,000 men. Each decision was appropriate to its circumstances, but the Americans, preparing to invade Kiska, couldn't know which decision the Japanese had made. They operated in uncertainty, prepared for the worst, and encountered something completely different. This uncertainty is inherent to warfare. No amount of intelligence gathering, no level of technological sophistication can eliminate it completely. There will always be things you don't know, can't know, until events unfold. The fog of war is a permanent condition. Part 14. The Strange Weapons. One of the peculiar aspects of the Kiska operation was the use of what might be called psychological weapons. Not weapons wielded by either side intentionally, but weapons created by the circumstances themselves. The fog was a weapon. It concealed movement, made identification impossible, turned friend into potential foe. Soldiers on Kiska found themselves fighting the fog as much as anything else. It created fear and confusion more effectively than any Japanese defensive strategy. The expectations were a weapon. Soldiers expected combat, expected death and injury, expected to face a determined enemy. This expectation wound them tight, made them hyper-alert, ready to shoot at anything that seemed threatening. When those expectations met the reality of an empty island, the result was chaos. The isolation was a weapon. Kiska felt like the end of the world to the soldiers who landed there. They were thousands of miles from home, on an island few people had heard of, engaged in an operation that made less sense with each passing hour. That isolation, that sense of being forgotten in a remote corner of the war, wore on morale. Even the success of the Japanese evacuation became a kind of weapon. The fact that the enemy had slipped away undetected made the American forces feel outwitted, embarrassed, less confident in their intelligence and planning. That psychological impact, while not measurable in conventional terms, was real. And then there were the actual weapons left behind. The Japanese had booby-trapped buildings and equipment before leaving. These traps claimed some casualties and created constant anxiety. Every building had to be entered carefully. Every piece of equipment had to be examined for explosives. The island itself had been weaponized in a sense, turned into a dangerous place even without defenders present. Part 15. Memory and Meaning. As we move toward the end of our story, let's consider what Kiska means in the larger context of history and human experience. Kiska is often remembered, when it's remembered at all, as a joke. The invasion where the enemy had already left. A comedy of errors with tragic elements. The battle that wasn't a battle. But that framing misses something important. For the men who were there, Kiska was no joke. It was frightening and confusing and dangerous. Men died. Others were wounded. Everyone involved experienced the stress of preparing for combat, the terror of landing on a hostile shore, the confusion of trying to fight an enemy they couldn't find. The fact that the Japanese had evacuated didn't make the American and Canadian experience less real or less difficult. The fear they felt was genuine. The fog they struggled through was real. The bullets that killed some of them, even though fired by friendly forces, were just as deadly as enemy fire would have been. Kiska demonstrates that war is not always the clear-cut clash of armies that we see in movies or read about in simplified histories. Sometimes war is confusion and fog and tragedy born of circumstances no one fully controlled or understood. The operation also raises questions about how we remember military history. We tend to remember dramatic victories and terrible defeats. We remember battles where heroes emerged and clear narratives can be drawn. Kiska doesn't fit these templates. It's messy and embarrassing and hard to turn into a clean story. But perhaps that's exactly why Kiska deserves to be remembered, because it shows us a different face of war, one that's less comfortable but no less true than the face shown by more famous battles. For the families of those who died on Kiska, the strangeness of the battle didn't make their loss any less painful. A father who received word that his son had been killed on Kiska grieved just as much as if that son had died fighting Japanese soldiers rather than being shot by accident in the fog. The Gold Star Mothers, as they were called, women who had lost sons in the war, didn't distinguish between those who died in conventional combat and those who died in the peculiar circumstances of Kiska. Their sons were gone. That was what mattered. In this sense, Kiska teaches us about the universality of grief in wartime. The circumstances of death matter less than the fact of loss. Whether a soldier dies heroically or accidentally, whether his death serves a clear purpose or seems meaningless, his family's pain is the same. This is something worth remembering in all our encounters with military history. Behind every casualty figure, behind every statistic, are individual lives and individual griefs. The manner of death might affect how the military records it or how history remembers it, but it doesn't change the fundamental loss. Part 16. What the veterans would say. As with our story of Atu, it's worth considering what the veterans of Kiska might want us to know, based on what many of them said in later years. First, they would want us to understand that their experience was valid even though they didn't fight a conventional battle. They were there. They faced danger. Some of their friends didn't come home. The strangeness of the circumstances doesn't invalidate their service or their sacrifice. Second, they would want us to learn from the mistakes that were made. The intelligence failures, the friendly fire incidents, the confusion and poor visibility that led to tragedy. Military forces should study Kiska not as a joke, but as a cautionary tale about what can go wrong even in operations that should be straightforward. Third, they would want us to remember the specific individuals who died, not as statistics or footnotes, but as people. Young men with names and families and futures that were cut short on a foggy island for reasons that seemed less clear with each passing year. Fourth, Many veterans would want us to understand the psychological impact of their experience. The confusion of Kiska, the fear of fighting shadows, the trauma of friendly fire incidents, these things stayed with men for decades. PTSD wasn't well understood at the time, but many Kiska veterans suffered from it nonetheless. Finally, they would probably want us to see Kiska in the context of their whole service. For many, Kiska was just one operation among several. They went where they were sent, did what they were asked to do, and tried to survive. Kiska was strange, but it was just one part of a larger story of service and duty. Part 17. The Aleutians Remembered. Both Attu and Kiska are part of a larger story about the Aleutian campaign, and it's worth stepping back to see that campaign as a whole. The Aleutians were never going to be the place where World War II was decided. Both the Japanese and American high commands knew this. The islands were too remote, the weather too severe, the strategic value too limited. And yet, both sides poured resources into the Aleutian campaign. Japan invaded and occupied Attu and Kiska. America fought to retake them. Thousands of men were committed. Ships and aircraft were devoted to the campaign. All for islands that, in the grand scheme of the Pacific War, didn't much matter. Why? Partly because of the symbolism. For America, no part of American territory could remain under enemy occupation. It was a matter of pride and morale. For Japan, the Aleutians represented their furthest advance, the most territory they ever took from the United States. Partly because of the strategic possibilities, however remote. The Aleutians could theoretically serve as bases for operations in either direction. Neither side could risk letting the other have free use of them. And partly because of inertia. Once forces are committed, once operations begin, it's hard to stop. The Aleutian campaign took on a life of its own, continuing even when both sides might have acknowledged privately that the effort exceeded the value. The result was a campaign that cost both sides significant resources and lives for minimal strategic gain. A sideshow to the main events of the Pacific War, but one that was very real to the men who fought in it. The Aleutian campaign is also a story about fighting in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The cold, the fog, the wind, the isolation, these were as much the enemy as the opposing forces. On both Attu and Kiska, more men were casualties of the environment than of enemy fire. Exposure, frostbite, trench foot, accidents caused by poor visibility and difficult terrain. The Aleutians punished everyone who came there, regardless of which side they fought for. This environmental challenge gives the Aleutian campaign a unique character. Most World War II battles in the Pacific were fought in tropical conditions, on jungle-covered islands, in heat and humidity. The Aleutians were the opposite, subarctic conditions where snow and ice were common even in summer. The soldiers and sailors who served in the Aleutians had to adapt to conditions unlike anything most of them had experienced. They had to learn to function in constant dampness, to maintain weapons and equipment in the cold, to navigate in fog so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. They did learn, and they did function, but it was never easy. The Aleutians tested human endurance in ways few other battlefields did. The men who served there deserve recognition for simply having survived those conditions, combat aside. Today, the Aleutian Islands are once again quiet and largely empty. The military bases have been abandoned. The fortifications have crumbled. Nature has reclaimed the battlefields. A few people visit each year, researchers mostly, or adventurers seeking remote places. They find rusting equipment, collapsed buildings, the fading traces of a campaign that once seemed important. There are memorials. In Alaska, in the military cemeteries, in a few other places, there are markers that remember the Aleutian campaign. These memorials list names, record dates, acknowledge that something significant happened in those distant islands. But for most people, the Aleutians are unknown territory, both geographically and historically. If they think of the Pacific War at all, they think of Pearl Harbor and Midway, Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, the Philippines and Okinawa. The Aleutians don't register. This forgetting is natural. perhaps inevitable. We can't remember everything. History has to be selective. But there's value in occasionally bringing forgotten stories back into the light, in remembering what has been forgotten, in telling the stories that don't fit the standard narratives. That's what we've tried to do here, with both Atu and Kiska, to tell stories that deserve to be remembered, even though they're strange and difficult and don't always fit comfortable templates. Part 18. The lessons of fogless. Let's return to that fog one more time, because it's central to understanding Kiska and what the battle teaches us. The physical fog that covered Kiska created most of the problems that plagued the invasion. It made visibility impossible. It prevented proper identification of targets. It allowed fear and imagination to transform shadows into enemies. Without that fog, the friendly fire casualties might never have occurred. But the fog also serves as a metaphor for the broader uncertainties of warfare. Military planners try to dispel the fog of war through intelligence gathering and reconnaissance. They want to see clearly, to know what they're facing, to make informed decisions. But sometimes the fog can't be dispelled. Sometimes you have to make decisions and take actions without clear knowledge of the situation. Sometimes you land on a beach not knowing if the enemy is there or not, if the bunkers ahead are manned or empty, if the next moment will bring gunfire or silence. Kiska teaches us that this uncertainty is not just an inconvenience, but a fundamental condition of warfare. No matter how sophisticated your intelligence, no matter how thorough your planning, you can't eliminate uncertainty. You can reduce it, but you can't eliminate it. And in that uncertainty, mistakes happen. People make wrong decisions based on incomplete information. They fire at shadows that turn out to be their own comrades. They prepare for battles that don't materialize or fail to prepare for battles that do. The question isn't how to eliminate these mistakes, because that's impossible. The question is how to minimize them, how to operate effectively despite uncertainty, how to learn from errors when they occur. Kiska also teaches us about the relationship between expectation and reality. The soldiers who landed on the island expected combat. Their training, their briefings, every aspect of their preparation had focused on the battle they would have to fight. When reality turned out to be different from expectation, they struggled to adjust. They were psychologically prepared for one experience and encountered another. This mismatch between expectation and reality created its own dangers. In life as in war, we often prepare for one thing and encounter another. We make plans based on assumptions that turn out to be wrong. We expect certain outcomes and get different ones. The ability to adapt, to adjust our understanding and our actions when reality doesn't match expectation, is crucial. The soldiers on Kiska had to adapt in real time, had to shift from prepare to fight to figure out what's actually happening here. Some adapted well, others struggled. The friendly fire incidents represent failures to adapt, moments when soldiers fell back on their training and expectations even though the situation had changed. This isn't a criticism of those soldiers. Adapting under stress is incredibly difficult. But it's a reminder that flexibility and the ability to question our assumptions are valuable traits, especially in uncertain situations. Part 19. The Japanese Perspective Revisited. We've touched on the Japanese perspective throughout this story, but let's consider it more fully as we near the end. From the Japanese point of view, the evacuation of Kiska was not just a tactical success, but a moral victory of sorts. They had saved over 5,000 men who would otherwise have been lost. In a war that was increasingly going against them, saving lives was important. The decision to evacuate rather than fight reflected a certain pragmatism in Japanese military thinking that's sometimes overlooked. While Japanese forces often fought to the death, as they did on Atu, they were also capable of tactical retreats when it made sense. The evacuation of Kiska showed that the Japanese High Command could be flexible when necessary. The soldiers evacuated from Kiska had spent months on the island, enduring conditions similar to what the Americans would later experience. They had been cold, wet, and isolated. They had been bombed repeatedly. They had been cut off from regular supplies. When the order came to evacuate, it must have seemed almost too good to be true. A chance to escape, to survive, to see home again. The fact that the evacuation succeeded, that they made it safely out despite the dangers, must have felt miraculous to many of them. But their relief was probably tempered by knowledge of what was coming. The war was not going well for Japan. These men were being saved from Kiska, but they would likely fight again elsewhere, in battles that might be even more desperate. Some of the men evacuated from Kiska would survive the war. Others would die on other islands, in other battles, as the American advance continued across the Pacific. Their escape from Kiska bought them time, but it didn't guarantee survival. Looking back, the Japanese soldiers who were on Kiska have their own perspective on the strangeness of what happened there. They had prepared for an American invasion. They had built defenses, positioned weapons, mentally readied themselves for a final battle similar to what had happened on Attu. Instead, they were evacuated under cover of fog. They left behind their fortifications, their supplies, their equipment. They slipped away quietly while the Americans prepared to attack. When they learned later that the Americans had invaded the empty island, had suffered casualties from friendly fire while searching for an enemy that wasn't there, some might have felt a grim satisfaction. They had outwitted a larger force, had escaped a trap, had turned the tables in a small way. Others might have felt only relief that they hadn't had to fight that battle. They had seen friends die on Attu or other islands. They knew what combat was like. If they could avoid it through clever evacuation rather than desperate combat, that was fine with them. And some might have reflected on the strange contingencies of war. If the fog hadn't rolled in at the right time, if American intelligence had been better, if the evacuation had been detected, they would have been trapped on Kiska. They would have fought and likely died there. Instead, they lived. The difference between life and death had been timing and weather and luck. Part 20. Final Reflections. We're coming to the end of our story about Kiska, this strange episode in the larger story of World War II. Before we close, let's gather some final thoughts about what it all means. Kiska reminds us that history is full of strange twists, unexpected outcomes, events that don't fit neat patterns. We like our historical narratives to be clean and logical, with clear causes and effects. But reality is messier than that. The invasion of Kiska was planned carefully by smart, experienced military professionals. It was based on intelligence that seemed solid. It was executed by brave, well-trained soldiers. And yet it turned into something no one anticipated, a battle against ghosts and fog, rather than a conventional fight against a determined enemy. This doesn't mean the planners were incompetent or that the soldiers failed in their duty. It means that war, like life, contains elements of chaos and unpredictability that can't be completely controlled or foreseen. Kiska also reminds us about the human cost of war, even in operations that don't involve combat in the traditional sense. The men who died on Kiska died in service to their country. Their deaths were no less tragic because they resulted from friendly fire rather than enemy fire. Their families grieved just as much. Their sacrifice was just as real. And the men who survived Kiska, who went through the fear and confusion of those days, carried that experience with them. Some were psychologically scarred by what happened. Others processed it as just another strange episode in a war full of strange episodes. But all of them were affected by it. War is often described as a test of courage, of endurance, of skill. All of that is true. But Kiska shows us that war is also a test of adaptability, of the ability to function when the situation is confused and the information is incomplete, and nothing is quite what you expected. The soldiers on Kiska were tested not by enemy fire, but by uncertainty and environment. They had to operate in conditions of zero visibility. They had to make split-second decisions about whether a sound or a shape represented a threat. They had to maintain discipline and follow orders, even when the orders seemed to make less sense with each passing hour. Some met this test well. They kept their heads, followed procedures, didn't panic. Others struggled, and their struggles sometimes had tragic consequences. This isn't a moral judgment. Under stress, in frightening conditions, even well-trained people don't always perform optimally. What Kiska teaches us is compassion for the difficulties faced by soldiers in combat, broadly defined. It's easy to judge from a distance, to say what should have been done. It's much harder to be there, in the fog, with incomplete information, facing what you believe is mortal danger. The story of Kiska is also, in the end, a story about memory and forgetting. Kiska has been largely forgotten, even more so than Attu. It's an embarrassing episode, one that doesn't fit comfortably into triumphant narratives of World War II. But forgotten doesn't mean unimportant. The men who served on Kiska, who died there or survived it, were part of the war effort. Their service mattered, even if the specific operation they participated in turned out to be problematic. By telling stories like this, by bringing forgotten episodes back into the light, we honor all those who served, not just those who participated in famous victories. We acknowledge that military service often involves doing difficult things in difficult conditions, whether or not those things end up in history books. We also learn lessons that might otherwise be lost. The tactical and strategic lessons of Kiska, the importance of good intelligence and proper identification procedures, remain relevant. The human lessons about fog and fear and the fog of war are timeless. Conclusion: the empty island. Let's bring our story to a close by returning one last time to Kiska itself, the island at the center of this strange tale. Kiska sits today much as it did before the war, cold and windswept and empty. The harbour where the Japanese fleet came to evacuate the garrison is quiet. The beaches where thousands of American and Canadian soldiers landed are untouched by human presence. If you could visit Kiska today, and very few people do, you would find traces of the events of 1943. Rusting equipment scattered across the tundra, the remains of buildings long since collapsed, shell casings and unexploded ordnance that occasionally turn up despite decades of weathering. But mostly, you would find emptiness. An island where something significant once happened, but which has returned to its natural state. The wind blows. The fog rolls in and out. In summer, flowers bloom. In winter, snow covers everything. The ghosts of Kiska, if ghosts exist, would be many. The Japanese soldiers who occupied the island for over a year, who were bombed and isolated and eventually evacuated. The American and Canadian soldiers who came expecting a battle and found something stranger and in some ways more frightening. The men who died there, killed by friendly fire in the fog, whose deaths seemed particularly pointless and tragic. All of them are part of Kiska's story. All of them experienced something there that shaped their lives, for however long those lives continued. And all of them deserve to be remembered, even though the battle they fought or didn't fight has largely been forgotten. Thank you for listening to this story of Kiska, the ghost battle, the invasion where the enemy had already left. Thank you for spending this time considering an obscure episode in a forgotten campaign, for thinking about fog and fear, and the strange ways history unfolds. The Battle of Kiska, or rather, the non-Battle of Kiska, reminds us that war is more complex and more human than our simplified narratives often allow. It reminds us that things don't always go according to plan, that intelligence can be wrong, that soldiers face dangers beyond enemy fire. Most importantly, it reminds us that every military operation, successful or failed, conventional or strange, involves real people who deserve our remembrance and our respect. The soldiers who landed on Kiska did their duty. The fact that their experience was different from what they expected doesn't diminish their service. May those who died on Kiska, in that fog and confusion, rest in peace. May those who survived it have found some peace with the strangeness of what they experienced. And may we remember them and learn from their story, even as we acknowledge how strange that story is. The island of Kiska remains, empty and windswept, holding its secrets and its memories. The ghosts of August 1943 linger there, in the fog that never quite lifts, in the silence that once echoed with gunfire aimed at shadows. This is where our story ends, with an empty island, a forgotten battle, and a reminder that history is stranger and more human than we often imagine. Thank you for listening. The end.